Good evening, Sergeant Major. Thank you for taking time out of your day to evaluate my briefing, 7 Hours in Osan, an analysis of Task Force Smith and the consequences of a colonial army. My name is Command Sergeant Major John Miller, and this is an unclassified briefing. So why are we here? What is the significance of Task Force Smith? Task Force Smith was the first U.S. Army unit to come in contact with North Korean infantry and tanks to start the Korean War. We'll analyze in this briefing the significance of unit readiness and the significance of underestimating the enemy. First, let me introduce the key players. First of all, Task Force Smith was made up of two companies of U.S. Army infantry and one battery of artillery. The overall task force commander was Lieutenant Colonel Charles B. Smith. He brought with him approximately 406 soldiers. Prior to deployment, Lieutenant Colonel Smith commanded his unit at Camp Wood near the city of Kumamoto on the island of Kyushu, Japan. With him was Alpha Battery 52nd Artillery Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Miller O. Perry, battalion commander. With his 134 soldiers, he commanded Camp Hakata near the city of Fukuoka, also on the island of Kyushu. Other key players were Colonel Richard Stevens, who made the phone call to Colonel Smith, giving him command of Task Force Smith. Colonel Richard Stevens was present in Hawaii on December 7th, 1941, and remembers the phone call. His recollection of then and now were eerily similar. Next, Major General William Dean was commander of the 24th Infantry Division. His division, along with three others, fell under the command of the U.S. 8th Army, commanded in 1949 by Lieutenant General Walton Walker. Lieutenant General Walker brought with him a need for meaningful training. Last was General MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Far East Command. It was his urgence to the President of the United States that committed U.S. forces in July of 1950. Next, on the Korean side, the North Korean 4th Infantry Division and approximately 5,000 soldiers and approximately 100 to 150 T-34 tanks were barreling down on the city of Osan. The T-34 tank, a Soviet Union-made armor piece, was developed during World War II, was extremely agile, and had extremely thick armor. This fact would prove important later on during our briefing. So why is Task Force Smith significant? We'll analyze four reasons. First, manpower shortages. Second, inadequate training, equipment shortages, and last, we'll analyze an error of complacency and overconfidence in the U.S. fighting soldier. First up were manpower shortages. All units involved were below peacetime end strength, significantly, and far below wartime end strength to the tune of 66%. Generally, units consolidated manpower, which meant that the 3rd Battalion in each regiment generally was only occupied by soldiers in a caretaking role. In fact, when the executive officer of the 21st Infantry Regiment went to inspect several of the companies in the 3rd Battalion, he was met by the same motor pool officer at several different companies. Artillery strength was 2/3 of its end strength goal, and it wasn't until General Walker arrived that manpower fillers would arrive, starting in late 1949 and continuing early into 1950. Next, inadequate training. The primary mission prior to the arrival of General Walker was occupation duty, not training. The United States was coming off a victory in World War II, and over the 5 years prior had become a colonial army concerned with occupation duty of the country of Japan. The manpower shortages examined earlier led to too few troops to conduct meaningful training. Many times, units had to combine forces in order to conduct a meaningful training exercise, and even then, far less than the size of a battalion. Next, training space on the island of Japan was extremely limited. That meant that training events for regimental-sized units were too big to be conducted on the island of Japan. This fact would later serve the U.S. Army poorly during maneuvers on the peninsula of Korea. Next, there was no space capable of conducting live-fire maneuver drills, drills in which infantry and live-fire artillery act or work at the same time. Finally, there was no space to train with tanks. Last, there was limited live-fire ranges to conduct training with indirect weapons. So, artillery, mortars, and recoilless rifles had but one chance per year to go to a live-fire range. Next, equipment shortages. None of the regiments had tank companies authorized. Seeing as there was no way to train tanks at the small camps on the islands of Japan, tanks were not authorized for the 24th Infantry Division. The division's medium tank battalions trained with light tanks. The infantry units had very few heavy machine guns, absolutely zero 30 caliber machine guns, and very few recoilless rifles, and absolutely no anti-tank guns. Key facts that would slow the delaying movement of the North Korean army later on. Also missing were key pieces of information or key pieces of equipment, such as bipods for mortars, radios, and sights. Next, in addition to having equipment shortages, there were very few rounds of ammunition, specifically high explosive anti-tank. Later on, we'll find that this is an extremely difficult issue for the U.S. Army to deal with. Units did donate equipment at deployment time to make sure the 1st Battalion and the 52nd Artillery Battalion had as much equipment as possible. Last, there was an air of complacency and overconfidence by the U.S. servicemen in Japan. The original mission priority was occupation and led to an extremely easy duty. New soldiers were not motivated by combat or national service. They were motivated by the GI Bill and low-interest loans after their service. A transition to colonial army lifestyle meant that families were now authorized to join their service member. Almost overnight, duty day turned into a 9-to-4 type job. Officers and NCOs had very comfortable lives. Many had Japanese servants. They hosted dinner parties and enjoyed Saturday nights at the O Club and NCO Club. Upon deployment, the attitude was, "We'll be home by Christmas" mentality. The lower enlisted, many had no combat experience and had an unrealistic view of combat. This is the end of part 1.